From Impact Alpha, it's This Week in Impact, where we bring you some of the most interesting impact investing stories of the week. It's Friday, June 27th. I'm Brian Walsh, and I'm joined this week by Impact Alpha editor Jessica Pothering. We'll discuss teeing up November's Global Climate Summit, COP30 in Brazil, with inclusive, nature-based, Indigenous-led, and Catalytic climate capital. Plus, a new tool for adaptation finance helps direct scarce concessional capital to where it's needed most. And finally, as older Americans make up the fastest growing demographic in the US, making the case for aging lens investing. That's all coming up on This Week in Impact. Hi, Jessica. Welcome back to the podcast.
Hey, Brian. It's great to be here. Thanks.
Great to have you. All right. Well, first up, attention has been turning to Brazil, which hosts the annual climate summit known as COP30 this November. Impact Alpha had a few articles this week looking at various approaches to climate action and climate finance in Brazil and the broader region. Jessica, we're months away from COP30, but what are some of the climate-related financing issues already at play in Brazil?
That's right, Brian. So this year's COP Climate Summit, COP30, takes place in Belém in Brazil. And so naturally, with this big global summit being in the heart of one of the most biodiverse regions in the world, close to the Amazon, you can only imagine how much nature-based and biodiversity finance will be on the agenda, the financing component of the agenda. And so I think it really showed up for my colleague, Roberto Lima, who was in Sao Paulo a couple of weeks ago at the Converge Capital Conference. It was a climate conference in Sao Paulo. And a lot of the discussion there was about what the broader investor community is doing to mobilize capital for some of these nature-based solutions and biodiversity preservation and restoration.
So we hear a lot about nature-based solutions. What are some of the practical examples of these kind of investable solutions?
I think the one that gets the most attention tends to be around sustainable agroforestry, forest replanting. But there are a number of other models. One of the newest and kind of most interesting ones is this concept of a debt for nature swap, which allows countries to trade in or refinance rather portions of their sovereign debt at a lower interest rate and use those interest rate savings for ecosystem restoration and protection. There was a big one. The most recent one, I think, was in Ecuador. Ecuador has actually done two. And the most recent one was for $1.5 billion, which will free up some $400 million for natural ecosystem preservation and restoration. Their first one was actually for marine ecosystem protection in the Galapagos Islands.
That's an interesting example. So what are some other examples on the ground here?
Oh, sure. Roberto, when he was in Sao Paulo, he talked to a number of different finance practitioners that are all coming up with these kind of interesting models ahead of COP30. There's this one called Estimulo. They're a Brazilian impact fund manager, and they're actually getting ready to come out to market with a new blended finance debt fund that will support small businesses in the Amazon. The structure of that fund, it'll have a senior tranche and a matching subordinated tranche to give investors a couple of different risk profiles. There's also another Sao Paulo-based fund manager called KPTL. They're in the market with a blended finance fund that is meant to encourage private investors to back restoration projects in the Amazon. And actually, in their view of the Amazon goes beyond just Brazil. So they're looking also in Ecuador, Bolivia, Peru, Colombia. And what I thought was interesting, they're also going into Guyana and Suriname, which are two markets we almost never get to report in the impact scene. And then also there's this really interesting initiative that the Brazilian government launched last year called EcoInvest, and they offer banks low-cost financing from, they have a national fund for climate change that is backed by a number of different multilateral development institutions as well. And what that program does is it allows banks and other financial institutions to bid at an auction for low-cost capital from this climate fund with a commitment that whatever capital they win, they will leverage that to raise additional funding from domestic and international investors. They did their first auction last year, and the second one was announced in April, and that one is focused on restoring degraded land in, I think, 5 of the country's ecological zones. So those are 3 of the examples that Roberto reported out, and what I thought was interesting in all of those is just how prominent the blended finance structuring is to try and mobilize capital for these kinds of solutions, given how nascent the sector is.
So take us a little bit deeper on that. What do you mean by the blended finance capital here?
Well, I mean, there's just not a lot of commercial capital moving into many aspects of climate finance, right? But particularly climate finance is focused on conservation or restoration or anything that's sort of focused on the natural ecosystems. I think there just aren't a lot of models that mainstream investors know how to deploy capital through at scale at this point. And so these risk protection mechanisms, blending public and private financing and also philanthropic funding is going to be really necessary to get some of these newer and, sometimes perceived to be riskier models off the ground.
Now, the Amazon is home to many indigenous communities, which are often overlooked when it comes to investing in general and climate finance in particular, even though those frontline communities are often most at risk due to climate change. So, what's being done to address this issue?
That's right. And they're not, this neglect, I guess, for lack of a better word, of indigenous communities and the role they play in protecting some of the most biodiverse parts of the world. This isn't just an issue in Brazil, although Brazil does get the most attention as far as the Amazon region. But there are many smaller countries, Ecuador, Colombia, that are also within that bioeconomy of the Amazon. And so my colleague Eric Stein reported this week when he was in Quito a couple weeks ago at the CLIC Impact Investing Summit on a number of new fund managers that are developing these models that are not only focused on climate finance, small business finance, but are really focused on co-designing solutions with the indigenous communities that they're proximate to and working in. And then also, just ensuring that the types of capital that they're bringing into the market are appropriately designed and matched for indigenous and rural business owners and entrepreneurs. So it was really interesting to see this trend emerge. I had a conversation with the ImpactAlpha Capital team, which hosts the CLIC Summit a couple of weeks ago. And one of the things that they were saying is there's been this real shift in how impact investing is happening in Latin America in recent years, whereas, it used to be that most of the capital coming into the region was international money funneled through international fund managers. And now there's just so many more local fund managers percolating across the region. And because they are in market and they are closer to the communities that they're trying to serve, they do just have a much better sense of what the capital needs are and how to design these mechanisms to be more sustainable and impactful.
So local fund managers with the local expertise and insights sounds like a smart solution here. So what are some examples of some of these local fund managers?
Great. Yeah, this is always my favorite part of our reporting. I feel like most of the time I come on the podcast and I'm just name checking new fund managers that I've found out about, but this is, my favorite thing to talk about. So one of the ones that Eric met was this new manager called Aliados. And they're in the market with a blended finance fund that was actually co-designed with some of the indigenous entrepreneurs they're planning to invest in. And part of that co-design process was just making sure that the types of capital that they're providing, whether that's working capital or results-based financing, are really aligned to the needs of the businesses. And they're also going to be providing some technical assistance. One of my favorite examples actually is this company, Meliquina. It's in Argentina, and they are developing renewable energy and conservation finance projects with indigenous communities in Argentina and some of the broader Andean region. And one of the projects they have going on is this 18 million megawatt solar project where the community where it's being installed is going to get an equity stake. And that community is in charge of the environmental permitting process. And what I liked about this one is the model sounded a lot like the work that Navajo Power is doing in the US, building renewable projects and indigenous communities. And so, I'm really looking forward to learning a little bit more about this one from Eric.
All right. Well, you can read Eric and Iberto's pieces on climate finance in the lead up to COP30 on ImpactAlpha.com. There's also links in our show notes. For now, let's take a quick break. When we come back, a new tool for adaptation finance directs concessional capital to where it's needed most. Abundance is having a moment in the current discourse, yet its opposite, scarcity, is the tough reality when it comes to catalytic or concessional capital. Jessica, you just laid out the case that more catalytic capital is the key to so many of the climate solutions that we need. So I was interested to read a piece this week in Impact Alpha highlighting a new tool to help drive the right kind of money to where it's needed most. So tell us about this new tool and what we've learned.
Columbia University just came out with this tool, as you mentioned, the Climate Finance Vulnerability Index. And what that offers is it's kind of a new ranking system for how to look at countries that are most vulnerable to climate change, but also least able to pay for adapting to climate change. And this tool was really designed with the recognition that there is a woeful shortage of adaptation finance circulating around. Last year's COP29 in Azerbaijan was dubbed the Finance COP, and this group of the most vulnerable climate countries had sought, commitments of $1.3 trillion from the international community. They got 300 billion. And against the backdrop of that also is the fact that now just development finance budgets are going down, development assistance is going down, and of course the need for adaptation finance is only going up. And so what the researchers at Columbia University sought to do with this is provide the small number of catalytic capital providers out there with a way of assessing where the risks are highest and the needs are greatest so that their money can be channeled in the most effective way possible.
So this Climate Finance Vulnerability Index, though, doesn't just say where to direct capital, but what kind of capital is needed. So tell us more about that aspect of it.
That's right. And sort of underpinning the where and why and how is the tool uses non-standard metrics in addition to things like a country's GDP or its sovereign credit rating to come up with this score. And so it ranks 191 countries, but by looking at things like how exposed are they to floods and droughts, the likelihood of heat waves and other big tropical storms alongside the country's financial health. So, what does their debt sustainability look like? What does their access to international finance look like? How financially integrated are they into the, global finance system? And what the researchers at Columbia said is that really their starting point was, okay, if you're in a position to provide concessional financing for climate adaptation, what is the information that you need most? So in that case, it's obviously where the need is greatest, where the risks are highest, but also things like, what type of money is needed. Some countries might need money for building physical infrastructure, which is a very different type of finance than easing a debt burden or, strengthening internal institutions. And so the goal of that was, as the lead researcher, Jeff Schlegelmilch said, is that we just want each dollar to have the most impact.
Right. So in a world of finite amounts of catalytic or concessional capital, but abundant amounts of commercial capital, you want to make sure that you are mobilizing that catalytic capital to the places where it's most needed and can most attract that commercial capital at scale.
That's right.
All right. Well, you can read Eric's piece on the Climate Finance Vulnerability Index on ImpactAlpha.com. There's also a link in our show notes. For now, let's take one more quick break. When we come back, a market hiding in plain sight, making the case for applying an aging lens to investing, as older Americans make up the fastest growing demographic. All right, we've had gender lens and child lens investing. Adding to those now is aging lens investing. As Impact Alpha has been tracking this new approach for some time now, we've had a new guest post this week from Brendan Ahern and Xenia Varag of the SCAN Foundation. Now, Jessica, before we get into their perspectives, can you help us define what we mean by aging lens investing? What is it, and what is the problem it's trying to solve?
Aging lens investing is really just, similar, as you said, to gender lens or child lens investing. It's looking at your investment portfolio with a lens of how these investments affect older Americans or other people in the world.
Yeah, so why is aging an investable opportunity?
Well, the senior population is the fastest growing demographic in the US, but also in Europe and in some other parts of the world. And I think why this is relevant is, in addition to this large aging population, there's also just this issue that not everybody is aging as comfortably as we would like as a society. I was listening to a segment a few weeks ago on New York Public Radio that mentioned that half of New Yorkers over the age of 70 have no retirement income, and the share of seniors living in poverty is on the rise. And so when you layer those two things together, this is a lens that is only going to be more relevant for the broader economy as a whole.
Right. So it's not just that there's a large addressable market with a growing aging population, but there's also disparities within that market. And a lot of low-income older adults are going to need to have more solutions and access to different kinds of services at different kind of price points.
That's right. Yeah. And I mean, unfortunately, I mean, probably most of our listeners wouldn't be surprised to hear that those disparities tend to track along demographic lines and, historically marginalized segments of the community. Black and Latino older adults face different challenges, particularly when it comes to critical things like access to affordable housing and affordable healthcare.
All right, let's turn back to this guest post from the SCAN Foundation. What are they trying to advocate for?
So Brendan and Xenia wrote this week about how to use this aging lens on an investment portfolio to think about some of these bigger structural disparities that we were just talking about. The crux of their post is really a set of just basic guidelines for investors as they're looking at new investment opportunities. They suggest asking questions like, does this solution address the root causes of aging poorly in home and in the community? Is there a plausible theory of change here for how the investment will directly benefit older people? Importantly, if it's successful, could it encourage others to invest in similar models and potentially bring in some of those commercial players that really aren't in this space or not using this lens yet?
All right, so what are some examples of the fund managers and the startups that are focused on these kinds of questions?
Well, one of the examples they cited is this company, Dandelion Health, which is part of SCAN's grant portfolio. And the company is working to address algorithmic bias in the healthcare sector and healthcare-related algorithms more broadly. So they're not necessarily specifically focused on older patients, but their model checks for bias around different social determinants of health, income and geography, for example, but also things like gender and race that could impact the care that older Americans receive in addition to just the general patient population. So I thought that was an interesting example that they brought up from their portfolio.
All right, that's a super interesting example, Jessica. And I understand that this guest post from the SCAN Foundation is kind of part of our overall coverage of the aging lens. Tell us a little bit more about that.
That's right. We have a partnership with Next 50, and they have committed to 100% mission alignment with their endowment, which is focused on issues around aging. And so we're going to be doing quite a bit more reporting on Aging Lens as we go. And so this is just one guest post in that series. And we'll be hitting at this from a number of different angles, looking at, again, social determinants of health, aging-related technologies, aging in place. So there's a lot more to come.
All right, that's super interesting. Now, you can read the full guest post, A Market Hiding in Plain Sight, The Case for Aging Lens Investing by the SCAN Foundation on ImpactAlpha.com. There's also a link in our show notes. You can also weigh in with your thoughts on our Slack channel. That's exclusive for Impact Alpha subscribers. But for now, that's going to do it for this episode of This Week in Impact. Thank you, Jessica.
Thanks a lot, Brian. It's great to be here.
Great to have you. And thank you all for listening. This Week in Impact is a production of Impact Alpha and part of the Impact Alpha podcast network. Smart conversations by and for impact investing professionals. For exclusive stories and insights about the world of impact investing and sustainable finance, join thousands of other agents of impact by subscribing. Just go to impactalpha.com/subscribe for full access. Thanks as always to our producer extraordinaire, Isaac Silk. For Jessica Pothering, I'm Brian Walsh, Managing Director of the impact advisory firm Human Nature. We'll see you next week for more Impact.